Shoutouts this week to some towns that have some of our largest numbers of listeners. Naturally, our hometown of Pittsburgh, but some big shoutouts to New York City, Washington, D.C., Seattle, Washington, San Francisco, Minneapolis, and Boston. And some listeners in other countries have let us know they're subscribers. Canada, Australia, Ireland, and the UK. We're actually in the rankings in Ireland, so thank you everyone for listening to us. Today's episode hits close to home for me. I've had the good fortune, no pun intended, to have worked with several companies on the Fortune 500 list over the years, and it's always been a source of pride. That's why today we decided to take a closer look at the iconic rankings with none other than the CEO of Fortune magazine. If you have a suggestion, a question, or a comment, send it to me through email at tim@shapingopinion.com, or if it's easier for you, just get in touch with me on Twitter or Instagram @shapingopinion. If you want, we can give you a shout out. And as always, thank you for being a listener of the Shaping Opinion podcast. You're the reason we do this. This is Shaping Opinion, a production of O'Brien Communications. Alan, what's the typical reaction you get when you tell someone their company has made the Fortune 500 for the first time?
Oh, I think it's an exciting reaction. I mean, people still see the Fortune 500 as a critical benchmark of success. I mean, the truth is, as you know very well, Tim, it measures size and size only. And we have a lot of other lists that measure speed of growth. We now have a Change the World list that looks at companies that maximize their positive impact on society. We have a profitability list, but making that size threshold is really important. And by the way, it has become particularly important overseas and particularly in China. It's really making the Fortune Global 500 list has become a critical symbol of success in Chinese business.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Alan Murray. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Fortune magazine. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we'll talk with Alan about the Fortune 500, its history, its significance today, and what it has said over the years about America's and the world's business evolution. Fortune magazine was founded in 1929 by Henry Robinson Luce. If that date doesn't mean anything to you at first glance, keep in mind the stock market crash that led to the Great Depression happened on October 24, 1929, that same year. This was 7 years after Henry had co-founded Time magazine with two Yale classmates. When Henry founded Fortune magazine, he said it should be for wealthy and influential people. He said it should be surpassingly beautiful, so that when readers turn the pages they will pay more, and they did. In that first year, subscribers paid $10 per year for the magazine, an unheard of price at that time. In the process, Fortune magazine featured some of the work of the country's greatest thinkers and writers: Ernest Hemingway, Archibald MacLeish, John Kenneth Galbraith. The first Fortune 500 list was published in 1955. Edgar P. Smith was an assistant managing editor at the magazine. He's the one who came up with the idea for the now iconic list. In that first year, the Fortune 500 rankings listed only companies that were in the manufacturing industry, the mining industry, and the energy industry. This made the list exclusive to several already well-known companies. In that first year, General Motors was the top company on the list. Its annual revenues were $9.8 billion. Alan Murray is the CEO of Fortune magazine today.
You know, what we have seen since the launch of the list in 1955 is that the average life of a company has shortened. The turnover is greater with each passing year. Now, you still have a bunch of companies like IBM, General Motors, General Electric, JP Morgan that have been on there from the beginning. But that number grows smaller each year.
Now, before we get started, Alan, I'd like to learn a little bit more about you. Can you tell us about your own background and what led you to become CEO of Fortune magazine?
So I've been a journalist pretty much my whole life. I started a neighborhood newspaper when I was 9 years old. I edited the high school newspaper. I edited the college newspaper. I got into journalism before I was old enough to make a intelligent decision about it. But I've also been involved in management jobs, again, pretty much from the very beginning. That first newspaper was an entrepreneurial venture. I managed newspapers and managed staffs throughout my career. So it's sort of been a dual track. The Fortune job happened because of the decision by Time Inc. to sell itself to Meredith, and then the decision by Meredith to sell off Fortune. Fortune was sold to a Thai billionaire by the name of Chachaval Jiyarabhanan, and he asked me to be CEO.
What was it about the offer that was so attractive to you?
Well, I think Fortune is one of the great brands in journalism, and particularly in business journalism, which is where I've spent most of my career. It has an 89-year history. It has become an iconic symbol of business success. You know, its history has great writers like James Agee and Archibald MacLeish who wrote for it, great photographers like Margaret Burke-White and Ansel Adams who shot pictures for it, and being asked to, in effect, save Fortune for the next century is an exciting challenge and one I'm up for.
You mentioned something about saving Fortune for the next generation, and this is separate from the Fortune 500 list, but one of the things we read about a lot in the media is the future of print. What are your perspectives on the future of the print version of magazines?
Well, I don't think print is going to go away any more than books went away. But I think what we have seen over the last decade or more is a pretty steady decline in print advertising and in print readership. And so the business model for print has to change. It's not going to be as strong as it was 20 years ago ever again. And that's what we're in the middle of working on, is how to create a business model that can last in the 21st century.
Well, one of the things I talked about in my intro today was when Fortune magazine was first created, and when Henry Robinson Luce came up with it, he described it as basically a very slick magazine that wealthy people would love to turn the pages. So there was part of that whole reader experience that he was talking about back then. You know, you want to hold it, you want to touch it, you want to turn that page and see what's next. And you can still achieve that, I know, online, and you do achieve that. One of the other ideas I talked about in the introduction was how the Fortune 500 list came about. Now let's talk about the list itself. Can you describe what is the Fortune 500?
Well, in the beginning, the Fortune 500 was a list of American industrial companies ranked by revenues. So it was size. It was all about size, and it was all about industry. It evolved over time to also include service companies. So it now ranks all American-based companies by revenues. And then we added a global list that measures all global companies by revenues. And an important caveat, though, we only rank companies that are publicly listed, publicly traded, and therefore make their data publicly available. We can't rank private companies like, say, Cargill or Mars or Bechtel that don't make their data available.
Obviously, the Fortune 500 in the U.S. does not include foreign corporations or companies that have been consolidated by other companies. So what is the methodology beyond revenues? I've seen that the criteria includes everything from earnings per share to the balance sheet to profits, and there's even data collected on the numbers of employees. What is I know that revenue is the main criteria, but are other criteria also factored into the decision making?
You have to put out enough data for us to evaluate it to be in the ranking. But once you qualify to be included in the analysis, it's a straight revenue ranking. It's really a pretty simple concept. How many dollars are you bringing in? And that's what it's been in the beginning. Now, if you go to the Fortune 500 list online, you can toggle around and say, geez, I'd like to see these companies ranked by profit. And then all of a sudden, instead of Walmart at the top of the list, you see Apple at the top of the list. So you can rank it, you can organize it in different ways, but the basic ranking is strictly revenues.
You mentioned Apple. That is a great example of one of the changes in the list over the years, because as you mentioned, back in 1955, those companies were mainly manufacturing companies. Apple would be a manufacturing company, but obviously it wasn't around back then. So there have been some major changes to the Fortune 500 over the years. The number that I saw was that 52 of the original Fortune 500 are still on the list. Over the years, there were more than 1,800 American companies featured on the Fortune 500. Changes have occurred: mergers, acquisitions, bankruptcies, changes in society. How has the Fortune 500 reflected some of those changes in society?
You know, it's a very dynamic list, and it's become more dynamic over time. I became editor of Fortune 5 years ago, and I remember a friend saying to me at the time, "You shouldn't do that job." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "Well, Fortune is the magazine of big business, and all the exciting stuff that's happening now is happening in small startups. Look at Google, look at Facebook, look at Netflix." And of course, all of those are now very large companies that rank high on the Fortune 500 list. And in fact, in some ways, as you well know, Tim, the predilection to become big fast in business has only grown over the course of the last 5 years. So when you talk about dynamism, which is the speed at which a company can scale up and make its way onto the Fortune 500 list, we've never seen anything like we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years.
Those companies are a great indicator, and one of the biggest changes that you've already mentioned is in 1994, that's when the Fortune 500 added service companies for the first time. And interestingly then, 291 of the 500 on that list were service companies, and that was the first year. 3 of those newly included companies that made that list were Walmart, which was number 4, AT&T, which made number 5, and Sears Roebuck and Company, which was number 9 that first year. Now, that Sears Roebuck item just stood out for me because when I was doing my research for this episode, I thought I have to ask Alan not about Sears, but about what that says about society. We had Sears on the list as a service company as number 9 in 1994.
Yeah.
And today we have Amazon that's number 5 on the list.
Yeah, well, you could do the simplistic linear analysis and say, oh, that means digital is replacing brick and mortar. But of course, as you know, that's not really the case. It has to do with how quickly the brick and mortar legacy companies have been able to adopt. I mean, we have a story in the most recent issue of Fortune magazine about Target, which is doing gangbusters. They had a 30% growth in same-store sales in the last quarter. Walmart itself is proving surprisingly nimble and adept in adjusting to the digital age. Sears is just an example of a great brand that destroyed itself. It was bought by hedge fund operator Eddie Lambert, who thought he could do retail better than the retail experts, and instead he destroyed the company. So I think the lesson is not that there has been a simple and linear transition from legacy companies to tech companies. The lesson is that our economy is more dynamic than ever before, that tech is changing every industry, and that you have to be incredibly nimble and innovative and willing to constantly disrupt yourself in order to survive and thrive. But you see companies on the list that have done just that and are doing quite well.
That's what I love about looking at this list. I looked at some of the names on that 1955 list, and just when you see the names, you start to wonder, what could they have done differently, or just they couldn't have done anything differently, but the world changed. Back in 1955, American Motors Brown Shoe, Studebaker, Collins Radio, Detroit Steel, they were on the list. Zenith Electronics, which was a big consumer electronics brand for the longest time, was on the list back then.
Yeah, well, Westinghouse and General Electric were kind of the two. I mean, my father worked for Westinghouse when I was growing up. Those two companies were kind of the competitive industrial powerhouses. Westinghouse, by and large, disappeared a long time ago. GE is falling apart now, but it just shows how quickly great brands can go if they don't have the leadership and the dynamism to constantly rethink and reinvent themselves and keep up with the times.
And that's an interesting point you make about great brands, because a lot of times when people think of great brands, they think of consumer brands. But in this case, we're also talking about corporate brands, because some of these companies have large numbers of consumer brands underneath their umbrella. Boeing, IBM, Procter & Gamble is a great example of a company with so many brands. Whirlpool, which is a brand in itself, they have been on the list since 1955. But then you mentioned some of these other names that are on the list in 2019 that weren't on the list in 1955. And these ones here say a lot. Target, you mentioned, was one of them. Amazon, Facebook, eBay, Home Depot, which is a brick and mortar store and an online store, Microsoft, Google, and Netflix. What are the big companies today on the Fortune 500 doing right?
You know, there is a contradiction that is inherent in large companies. Because they have so many people and are by definition so bureaucratic, there's a tendency to be slow, hard to change. You know, there's a famous book by Lou Gerstner, the former CEO of IBM, called Can Elephants Dance? And the elephant, obviously, is the large company. So bigness can easily equate to slowness, to inertia, to inability to change. The companies that are succeeding are the ones that have figured out how to fight that. How do you take the inherent inertia that exists in these large companies and figure out mechanisms that allow innovation, internal entrepreneurship, that allow great ideas not to be buried but to succeed? That's the fundamental difference between the great companies and the bad companies. It's culture. How do you create a culture that incentivizes and encourages and allows constant reinvention and constant innovation? It's not an easy task. It's the most difficult thing that companies have to face that day. But when you look at a great company, whether it's brick and mortar based like Target, or whether it's technology based like Microsoft under Satya Nadella, that's what distinguishes them.
Can you think of a company now that is doing something different or unique that gives it that culture that you mentioned?
Well, you mentioned P&G. I think P&G is struggling. But the reason I want to talk about P&G for a second is they made a decision maybe a decade ago to convert from a closed innovation system where they had their labs that were trying to invent things all by themselves to an open innovation system, to say that we have to pay attention to what's going on in the outside world. We have to look at what startups are doing, because we can't just assume the great ideas are going to come from us. And now I'm not sure if P&G has completely cracked that code, but I guess another example would be the one I just mentioned, which is Microsoft under Satya Nadella. I mean, Tim, you probably went to Microsoft in the old days under Steve Ballmer when, after the Apple iPad came out, you literally were not allowed to take an iPad into the headquarters of Microsoft. So they refused to look at their most important competition. Nadella has totally changed that culture. He said, we can't be an insular, closed culture. We have to be an open culture that looks at all the innovation that is going on outside of our walls, or we will die. So I think that's one important element of it, a willingness to look at what's happening in the rest of the world, a willingness to acknowledge that not all great ideas are going to come from your people. When
you read Fortune and you read about the Fortune 500, there's a phrase that comes up every now and then that Fortune seems to take pride in. And that is, they describe the Fortune 500 list as 500 different stories. Not just 500 companies on a list, but 500 different stories. How does Fortune approach tackling all of those 500 stories and giving them their due?
Well, it's not easy. We don't have a huge staff, but our staff is at heart storytellers. They're always on the lookout for great stories. That's what they do. That's what we do. And again, it's keeping your eyes open, looking for trends and looking for interesting stories.
I've seen some articles that start with Fortune 500 as a reference point. So it's kind of like when you say when someone wants a tissue and they use Kleenex, or when they use we talked about FedEx a couple episodes ago, and we talked about the issue of FedEx becoming a verb when someone wants to FedEx something to you or Google something. That's something when your company has made it. But I've also seen articles and other things in the media where they talk about the Fortune 500 as a key reference point. And one example of that would be, you might read an article in a totally different media outlet where they talk about Fortune 500 CEOs and where they got their MBAs. Or they might say, another article might be about cities that host the most Fortune 500 headquarters, or which industries count the largest number of Fortune 500 companies. They use that Fortune 500 as a benchmark for themselves. How else have you seen that done?
Yeah, no, I do think it's amazing 55 years later that the Fortune 500 has become a benchmark of business success. I mean, we've also now launched and licensed an ETF around the Fortune 500 because it turns out their performance is better than the broader market as a whole.
An ETF, by the way, just for the listeners, that's an exchange-traded fund. So that's a fund that mutual fund investors can invest in.
It would include all 500. So it allows you to invest in all 500 companies on the list and share in their success.
And how else have you seen the brand used?
Well, companies use it. The companies that sort of make it over the benchmark, use it frequently to describe themselves. As I was mentioning earlier, I think that's particularly true in China. It is not uncommon to walk into the headquarters of a large Chinese company and see on the wall in the entryway number 165 on the Fortune Global 500. It's just become it means you've made it. It means your company has succeeded, that you've entered the big time. And it's proven to be a remarkably enduring brand.
You mentioned how companies react to it. I was looking up different companies that made the list for the first time, and there was one company in 2019 that made it for the first time. And I thought it was pretty typical of how companies celebrate such an honor, and that was a company by the name of Zoetis. They celebrated with big events, news releases. That perpetuates the Fortune 500 brand. Every time a company makes that list, that helps the brand, doesn't it?
Yeah, and so the example this year is Xiaomi, the Chinese cell phone company, made the list for the first time and actually gave a cash bonus to all their employees for having made the list.
Now, do you have the opportunity to make the phone call to the companies that make the list for the first time yourself, or is that news delivered by somebody else?
They usually get the news at the same time everybody else gets it. It's, when the list is published, they find out their ranking. So there is an unveil. I think companies normally, because it's based on revenue, they normally have a pretty good idea if they're going to be on it or not, but their exact ranking is less clear, and they find out when you find out, when we publish the list.
One of the things that I know from my own experience with investor relations is the term material event. And that is anything that happens to a company that could affect its stock price. And depending on the company, there are different criteria for that. But I did have to ask you, when a company makes the Fortune 500, is that typically considered a material event for them?
Interesting. I don't think that's a question that I can answer. I think, it's certainly important for companies to make their way into index funds because it changes the index funds are like the Fortune 500 ETF that I referred to, and it opens up more capital into your stock price. And so that's material. But I couldn't tell you whether companies consider making it on the list a material event.
I guess there's a flip side to that too, though, and it probably would be the same answer for you, and that is, if a company drops off the list, would that be a material event? But since it's tied to revenue, and by then revenues have already been reported, it probably isn't in itself a material event.
It also depends on why. Some companies drop off the list because they were acquired. Some companies drop off the list because they have chosen to move their headquarters outside of the United States. So, or they drop off the list because they've split in two, and the two pieces individually don't rank on the list. So, I think it matters why it happened.
Alan, where do you see the Fortune 500 evolving going forward?
I think you'll see increasing emphasis on the global 500. I think that's becoming a critical part of the list. We keep a very close eye on private companies and think a lot about how we can try and include them in the ranking. But as long as they don't have to make their financials public, it's a pretty difficult thing for us to do. But I'll tell you, the enduring nature of this brand after 55 years makes me think that 20 years from now, one thing that will still be around, the members of it will be very different, but the one thing that will still be around is the Fortune 500 list.
Alan Murray, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Tim. Great to be with you.
To learn more about the Fortune 500, please see our show notes at shapingopinion.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please let people know by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. We'd love to hear from you on Twitter. Just tweet to us at Shaping Opinion, or you can get in touch with us through our website, shapingopinion.com. We have a Facebook page, and we're on Instagram at Shaping Opinion. Shaping Opinion is a production of O'Brien Communications. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.